some reason, my HDMI port has decided that it won't accept HDMI signal, but if I use an adapter.
HDMI, right?
If I do VGA to HDMI, it works.
I see. So weird.
I have no idea. I think it's because I migrated to Windows 11 and something went wrong in my software. Driving me nuts. So as before, we're recording to the laptop, so if you stay relatively close, it'll hear you.
Okay.
We have a 10-minute break in the middle.
Yeah.
Any other procedural things you need a refresher on? Or?
No, I think this time I said, let's gather back after you do the second activity. I learned that lesson.
Yes, yes. Okay, I have a couple of announcements for them, and then you don't need to go anywhere. It's going to take me like 5 seconds. Good afternoon, everyone. It is good to see you all. Where should you be on Friday? Quiz section. Why should you go to quiz section this Friday? Extra credit activity and review for the quiz. That is absolutely right. Now, there's also somewhere you could go Friday evening. Does anybody remember where you could go Friday evening? Yes, Connor.
Professor McCabe's lecture.
Yes, yes. Do you want to say anything about what you're going to talk about?
Yeah, I'll be talking about my research, which is on, in this particular talk is on a Arabic grimoire, so a handbook of practical magic and its kind of circulation broadly. Yeah.
Very cool. So if you guys go and then you come over to Canvas and tell me a little bit about the lecture, you will get extra credit. So I realize it's not the greatest time of day, but hopefully some of you guys will be able to go and enjoy it. Okay, today Dr. McCabe is going to talk to us about stories from the Arab world. So everybody please pay careful attention. How do you want the lights? Do you want the lights
Dimmed on the front would be nice, yeah.
Okay. It's like this.
Oh yeah.
Unfortunately.
Kind of the opposite, but that's
Yes.
that's okay. Okay.
Could someone pull the door shut? Thank you so much.
Hey, welcome. So I titled my lecture today, 1001 Journeys of the Arabian Nights. My plan today, let's see. So first I'm starting off with a lecture on the history of the 1001 Nights. And this will be an interactive lecture. So the questions that are named on your handout, you'll get the question on the PowerPoint itself. So we'll pause to stop 3 times to kind of reflect and ask some questions of you. This will be the first half, and then the second half we'll come back and we'll talk about the Arabic novel. Again, I'll have a short lecture introducing the Arabic novel and the novel we read today. So we read from Naguib Mahfouz's Arabian Nights and Days. He is the only author writing in Arabic to have won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He's very, very famous in the world of the Arabic novel. And then I have a brief reading activity where you'll be working in groups and answering some questions about the readings we did. So before diving in to 1001 Nights, I'm going to do two preparatory exercises. One is myself giving credit where credit is due. So today in my lecture, I'm taking inspiration from a recent lecture I watched here. This is available on YouTube that Professor Paul Cobb gave at the museum at the University of Pennsylvania, where the format he took for his lecture inspired the format I'm taking today. I also read this summer this amazing new, what's called the Annotated Arabian Nights. It's really incredible, has amazing kind of collection of artwork. The Arabian Nights has inspired a lot of artwork over centuries. This is, they say, Yasmin Seal is the first woman to translate the 1001 Nights, and we'll learn today about why she has to translate the Nights from several languages. Primarily, she's translating from Arabic and French, Why are some of the Arabian Nights written in French? That's something we will learn about today. And finally, this book is this book of travels is something I've read really closely, and you'll see where that kind of comes up in the lecture today. So first, turn to your handout and just jot down. This is like a diagnostic question. When you hear this phrase, 1001 Nights or the Arabian Nights, what do you think of? What are some words, names, or ideas that come to mind, and what do you associate with them? And if you've never heard of this before, that's also interesting. You can write that down. I'll just give you a minute. Okay, anyone want to shout out something they wrote down? What do you associate with the 1001 Nights? Mm-hmm.
Mostly just growing up like Aladdin, palm trees, desert oasis.
Nice. Yes, Aladdin. Aladdin's definitely the most famous story from 1001 Nights here, especially in America, because of the Disney movie and then even the Disney remake of the movie. And so you can kind of picture that world when you think of the Nights, this world that's like somehow in the past, sometime in the past, somewhere exotic, maybe deserts are there. Anything else come to mind when you think of the Arabian Nights? Has anyone never heard of them or? Okay. So today I'll be telling you a story. Actually, I'll be telling you a lot of stories, and these stories all kind of overlap and weave into one another. And I'm taking this approach because that is the format of the 1001 Nights. So the 1001 Nights has a very famous frame tale. So we start off with the story that then sets kind of the premise for a series of independent stories. But even when you get into these stories, you find a story within a story within a story. I kind of think of it as like a Russian nesting doll or matryoshka dolls, where you keep getting kind of a character will tell a story, and in that story, a character will tell a story. It's nested like this, and then you'll kind of come back out from the nesting back into the frame story. Today, I'll be using this outline system. It's called like the alphanumeric outline system to help you kind of keep track of where we are in the story. So moving kind of to stories within a story and then back out into the frames. So you all have this outline will be on all these slides to keep track of where we are. So we'll start off with our own frame story, The Misadventures of Lillian the Learner. And I'm Lillian, that's my name. So once upon a time, in a faraway land called North Carolina, about over a decade ago, Lillian was an undergraduate at Davidson College. This is a small liberal arts college. About 1,600 students were there when I was there. I was really close to my professor of Islamic studies. There was only one professor teaching about Islamic history. I had taken about 3 classes with him. And at the end of one semester, he told me that he was considering a new course and wanted to know if I'd be interested in it. He said this new course was going to be called Classics of Islamic Literature. And I said, absolutely, I would love to be in a class where we read books. And he said that the format would be that we would read 1 book per week in this class, some type of classic of Islamic literature. And for each week, a student or a group of students would be tasked with kind of providing the historical background of that book. So Where was this book written? Who wrote it? Why is it significant as a piece of Islamic literature? He asked me, do you have any recommendations or a book that you really want to read in the classroom setting? And I said, The Arabian Nights. And he was a bit skeptical, although I didn't understand why at the time. He said, okay, that's fine. I will assign The Arabian Nights, but I'm assigning it as the first book we read, and you have to do the presentation on it. So sure enough, the next semester came. My professor offered this course, Classics of Islamic Literature. And soon enough, it was time for me to actually get to sit down and read The 1001 Nights. It was this edition of it, from cover to cover. So I went to, this is my college, Davidson, and I went to the library. This is our library at Davidson College. I sat down in one of these yellow chairs and I started to read. And I read the story of King Shahryar. Once upon a time, many years ago, in the far-off land of Persia, there lived a king named Shahryar. He ruled over a large and successful kingdom, and by his side ruled his beloved wife. One day, he decided that he missed his brother. His brother was also a king who ruled over the neighboring kingdom. So King Shahryar sent his vizier. A vizier is like the second in command in a kingdom. He sent his vizier to go fetch his brother from the neighboring kingdom. The vizier did so and arrived back about a week later with the brother of King Shahryar, whose name is King Shah Zaman. Shah Zaman arrived looking pretty terrible and a little traumatized. And he said to his brother Shahryar, "You will never believe what just happened to me." And he told him a story. Once upon a time, about a week ago, you invited me to come to visit your kingdom. So I left my palace and I was on my way to you when I realized that I forgot something really important at home. So you know that feeling when you wake yourself up in the middle of the dream, remembering that you forgot something? It's like basically that happened to me. I was sleeping, I was in my tent. I woke up in the middle of the night thinking, oh my gosh, I forgot something. I have to go back and get it. So even though it was late at night, I decided to make a quick return to my bedroom in the palace to retrieve it. But when I opened the door to my bedroom, I saw something terrible. My wife, naked, in bed with another man. That other man, in fact, was an enslaved man who works for me, or technically who I own, no less. And brother, I think your wife might also be up to no good. So let's try to catch her in the act. This is King Shah Zaman's story. Back to the story of King Shahryar. So King Shahryar and his brother Shah Zaman concocted a plan to see if they could catch King Shahryar's wife, the queen, in also kind of in a compromising position. So the two brothers announced a plan to go on a hunting trip. But instead of sleeping in their tents, they snuck back to the palace. And sure enough, they found what they feared they would: King Shahryar's wife having sex with another man, also with an enslaved man who the king owned. Shahryar returned to the palace the next morning and had her beheaded. He was a changed man. You could say he kind of became a bit of a monster. King Shahryar decided that women could not be trusted at all, that women were by nature cheats and unfaithful and not deserving of love or trust or mercy. So what was his solution to this realization? He decided that he would only marry young virgins and then kill them right after consummating the marriage. This would ensure that they could never be unfaithful. So it's pretty hard to cheat on your husband when you're dead. You know that game of F, marry, kill? Basically, that's what he was doing every night with the new young girl. And this was happening on pretty regular basis. So this continued for 3 years. So you can imagine, that's almost 1,000 people who were killed. After 3 years, the kingdom was running out of eligible young women for the king to marry and kill. So now enters Scheherazade. Scheherazade was the daughter of the vizier. So remember, the vizier is the king's kind of second in command, and they have a close relationship with one another. King Shahryar never suggested marrying the vizier's daughter because he respects the father, if not the daughter. But Scheherazade, she was the bookish type. She had read a lot of books. She had read a lot of stories, collections of stories. She had read histories and even knew a lot of poetry. And so the vizier, her father, was in charge of procuring brides for the king with this appetite that cannot be assuaged. And after 3 years, his job was getting more and more difficult as the kingdom was running out of young women for the king to marry. Scheherazade heard from him about the troubles that he was facing in his job, and he decided to volunteer herself to marry the king. So she asked her father, please, why don't you recommend me? I'll marry the king. Vizier was hesitant. Even the king was hesitant to accept this because we all know the deal that if she marries him tonight, she'll be dead by the morning. The vizier eventually resisted, at first resisted, but eventually gave in and married his daughter off to the murderous king. But Scheherazade had a plan. She wasn't going into this without a plan or completely naive because she knew what the deal was here. And she roped her younger sister, named Dunyazad, into her scheme that she started to concoct. So Scheherazade was married to King Shahryar, and the marriage was consummated. So King Shahryar and Scheherazade lay in bed after their marriage, both knowing that she was not long for this world. She asked the king, her new husband, to do her a favor. She said, please let my younger sister come and say goodnight to me. We all know that this goodnight will really be a goodbye. The king agreed because he was being merciful towards her out of respect for her father, and let Scheherazade's younger sister Dunyazad enter the kind of marriage bedroom, the bedchamber, to say goodnight and goodbye to her sister. So when Dunyazad entered the room, now kind of Scheherazade's plot is in action. Dunyazad says to Scheherazade, "Oh, sister, I will miss your nightly stories so much. Please tell me one last story to remember you by." With the king's agreement, Scheherazade began. So the summary of what happens in 1001 Nights is that Scheherazade starts to tell the story. She ends on a cliffhanger, and Dunyazad says, "Oh, please finish the story?" Scheherazade says, "No, it's too late, but maybe I can finish it tomorrow." And then they ask the king, can we wait until tomorrow night? And he says, sure. So this continues for 1001 Nights, where basically the king is keeping Scheherazade alive because she's telling stories. So over these nights, maybe she tells about 300 stories, each story broken up into about 3 nights. And then at the end of these 1001 Nights, the king ultimately kind of comes around and says, okay, murder is off the table. I won't kill you. By this time, Scheherazade also has given him sons, has had children, right? Because it's been 3 years basically. And also ultimately she saves herself through the power of storytelling. So now I'll just kind of again pause and I'll give you a couple minutes just to reflect. So this story, the story of King Shahryar and Scheherazade, is what we call a frame story because it's setting the scene for Scheherazade's storytelling. So all these other stories will be told. The way that I'm kind of using my own education, my path towards knowing about the nights as a frame to tell the story. So in the context of this frame story, what types of stories might you expect Scheherazade to tell the king? And maybe you can chat with each other. I'll give you a few minutes, maybe 4 minutes, and jot down some reflections about what types of stories you might expect to find in the collection, given that this is the frame story. Anyone like to share a reflection?
I was thinking, like, considering he let her live in the end, maybe a lot of stories about true love.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Love stories. So if he has this hang up that women are terrible, can't be trusted, maybe she could tell him stories where there are like heroines or like women who are faithful and strong, powerful, which is true. Yes, you find those types of stories. Exactly. Other types of stories you might expect.
Stories about betrayal and forgiveness.
Yes, absolutely. So there's kind of like stories that teach a lesson about why it's good to forgive people, right? So you can imagine she's like kind of subtly giving moral lessons about just leaders and merciful leaders and how they're the best. Yeah. Other ideas about what you might expect to find? Maybe the most obvious too is the cliffhangers that you often are leaving a story off where a character is about to die, so that there's this urgency that the story must be continued, right? And so there's a lot of classic cliffhangers in the format of the 1001 Nights. But yeah, really, I was thinking too about how these stories like have a purpose. Sometimes, right, that sometimes they're just entertaining and like you want to listen to them. Other times there are these kind of morals couched in there, especially about how to be a good ruler. The version, like the most popular version of the Frame Tale, even says that like Scheherazade was familiar with what's called this mirror for princes genre, which is a genre of texts where usually philosophers write about like how to be a good king. So she kind of is thought to take kind of inspiration from that too in her storytelling, where there will be kings in a lot of her stories who are very merciful and kind and love women and don't kill them all the time. Okay, so let's get back to imagining a story. We could say this is the first story, that's technically not, but a story that Scheherazade tells to her sister, Dunyazad. Once upon a time, in the faraway land of China, lived a young man named Aladdin. Aladdin's father had died, and he lived alone with his mother, trying to scrape by. One day, a merchant from the Maghreb, or from North Africa, appeared in town. He claimed that he was the younger and long-lost brother of Aladdin's father, making him Aladdin's uncle. He said that, "Aladdin, boy, I'm here. I know that you're in need. I have a great offer for you. I'm going to make you into a really successful merchant." This really appealed to Aladdin and to his mother, who were really struggling without having kind of his father around to take care of them and provide for them financially. So when this mysterious man from North Africa, offers to take Aladdin on his travels and set him up to become a successful merchant, Aladdin and his mother accept. So Aladdin then sets off with this stranger. So I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that this stranger was lying. This man was of no relation to Aladdin whatsoever, and basically was preying on him because he was young and unprotected and in a quite desperate situation. And he was looking for kind of a vulnerable young man to exploit because he had kind of a quest that he needed to complete that was very dangerous. He'd rather not do it on his own, so he came and got Aladdin to help him with it. So once they set out on their travels, the merchant, we learn, is actually a sorcerer. He is a magician. He's interested in finding magical objects, and magical objects in which there may be a powerful being residing, and that he wants to be able to kind of extract that powerful being from the object and then kind of bend that being to his will so that he can manipulate the world with this kind of superhuman power that these beings would be capable of. So this merchant / sorcerer brings Aladdin to a magic cave and told him that he had to go in there to retrieve a very special oil lamp from within. Aladdin goes into the cave, and that's what we see depicted here. where Aladdin's in the cave and the merchants on top are going to close the door on him, basically shut the access to the cave. So when he gets in there, he finds the lamp, but then is stuck within the cave. The sorcerer leaves him there, assuming that he had failed, that Aladdin hadn't been able to find the lamp. And he was kind of, this is not exactly what he wanted. He wanted the lamp, but hey, at least this like young man is the one who's going to die in there and not him. This is what he wanted, basically, unassuming young man, this task he wanted him to do for him. So Aladdin, meanwhile, was running out of hope for escape. He's in this cave, he's getting really hungry, and he starts kind of getting cold, and he starts rubbing his hand together. And when he does this, he rubs his hand over a ring that the sorcerer had lent to him for this kind of task. And when he rubbed his hand against the ring, a jinn popped out. So what is a jinn? Well, in English, the word genie is used, right? If you're familiar with Aladdin, it's called a genie. This comes from the Arabic word jinn. A jinn is a kind of a part of Arab and broader Islamic understandings of the world and of mythology, where jinn are these beings that are said to be made from a smokeless fire. And they're kind of like humans in the sense that God created them the way he created humans, and that they're not always evil, that jinn have free will. They can choose to be good or they can choose to be evil. We even hear stories that some jinn heard Muhammad recite the Quran and became Muslim themselves, and they're good jinn. But then there are also other evil jinn who use their power to maybe harm humans or trick them. Jinn are kind of thought to be living on this world with us, but almost like in a parallel plane, and they sometimes can like cross over into our plane. There are other stories that they just live in more secluded areas of the known human world, so like within ruins or in deserts, like far away from human civilization, but they can appear to humans in form. So when Aladdin rubs this, his ring, a jinn pops out, and this jinn in the story of Aladdin he's connected to the gem, and he's able to grant wishes. So of course, Aladdin wishes to be helped escaping from the cave, and the jinn does so. So he helps Aladdin escape, and Aladdin returns home to his mom with the lamp that he found within the cave back in China. That's where the story is said to take place. When he brings this lamp home to his mom's kind of excited, like, oh, this lamp looks pretty nice. We can at least go to the market and sell this, and maybe we'll get enough money that we can like feed ourselves for a month or so. So she starts to prepare this lamp in order to sell it. And what does she do? She starts rubbing the lamp to clean it, and out pops an even bigger and more powerful jinn. So of course, this is why the sorcerer wanted this magic lamp, because it contains this very powerful creature who also can grant wishes. So when this jinn appears, Aladdin and his mom use their wishes basically to get super rich. So they start amassing wealth, getting a lot of money, and they become rich like beyond their wildest dreams. And then Aladdin, because now he's quite a wealthy and well-off person, and with the jinn's help, he manages to procure the hand of a princess because he wants to marry the princess. If you're familiar with the movie, right, this is like Princess Jasmine or Yasmin. So this is like the classic rags to riches story. Now he's super wealthy and he can marry the princess. So when he marries the princess, the jinn builds him an amazing palace. And let's think about what this palace looks like. In the story of Aladdin, this palace is described as having like amazing water features, like fountains everywhere, and these rivers that are kind of moving around in the gardens of this palace. Such a beautiful, beautiful palace. Another thing that's detailed in the story is the throne that the jinn creates in this palace, a beautiful, lovely gilded throne that sits in this palace. And we'll come back to this description of what the palace in Aladdin looks like later. And so now Aladdin's all set up. He's really wealthy. He got to marry a princess. But then the sorcerer learns about what he has been able to accomplish. The sorcerer thought he had basically just left Aladdin for dead. And he's quite disappointed to learn that not only did he survive, but he got that magical object that he wanted to begin with, and that he had been successfully been able to use this magic lamp. So when the sorcerer heard that Aladdin had escaped the cave and become rich off of this treasure that he thought belonged to him, he began to plot his revenge. Okay, and the story stops there. Oh, it's getting late, Scheherazade said. It's a bit too late to continue with this story. Dunyazad begged her, oh, sister, please continue. I want to know, what's this? Is this sorcerer going to kill Aladdin? What's going to happen to Aladdin? Scheherazade said, well, I suppose I could finish the story tomorrow if the king allows it. So Scheherazade and Dunyazad look at the king, look at King Shahryar. The king himself, he was dying to know what's going to happen after this cliffhanger. So he agreed to let Scheherazade finish the story the next night, and so on does this kind of practice continue for the 1001 Nights. So, what was the frame for this story? Oh yeah, we last left me as an undergraduate at Davidson College, sitting here in the library reading this book for class. So I read all of this, the frame story, the stories, and more on that day as an undergraduate at Davidson College in the library. Well, one immediate kind of question that came to mind was the question of Islam. I was taking a class in the religious studies department. The class was called The Classics of Islamic Literature. And after reading this, I was like, this doesn't seem to have much to do with religion at all. Yeah, sure, some of the characters are described as Muslim, but Aladdin has like a Muslim name, Ala ad-Din. But it's also set in China, so it's kind of supposed to be foreign, supposed to be outside of the Islamic world, and it's not really a morality story about how to be a good Muslim. When we think about kind of religious literature, this probably wouldn't fit under that category. So now it was time to start doing some research. So as I said, not only did I have to read this book, but I had to present on it in front of my class in college to tell them kind of the history of the 1001 Nights. So I started to read some books, read some articles, trying to find out, where did the 1001 Nights come from and why are they so famous? So as I started reading more and more, I came to a terrible conclusion that this was a horrible book to choose for the class, and my professor knew it. And I started to prepare my presentation, and I went to class the next day ready to tell another story, and this is how it went. So, as I stood in front of my class, I said, once upon a time, in a land called France, in the year 1704, lived a man named Antoine Galland. And he published a book of stories that he had translated from Arabic. Galland was a scholar, and he had also traveled a lot and knew a lot of languages. He's what in English is called a dragoman, meaning he could speak Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. And he had traveled kind of around the Middle East, collecting manuscripts to study for his studies on kind of the history of Arabic literature and language. While he was traveling in Syria, he found a manuscript that was called 1001 Nights. So a manuscript means it's a document that was handwritten, written down by hand. And this copy that he found was from like the year 1400. So he's discovering this in about 1700. So at this time, the document he found was about 300 years old. That's pretty old. So that means someone had written down these stories and had been preserved and saved in a library for that long. And this manuscript captured an authentic tradition of storytelling in the Arab world. So storytelling has always been an integral part of Arab culture. And the 1001 Nights started as an oral tradition. So that means that these are stories that people would have memorized and recited overnights. So we can imagine kind of people a traveling storyteller who comes to a town and kind of sets up for a week telling a bunch of stories, using the frame story of Scheherazade and then telling some stories from the nights. We have really early attestation from early Arabic literature that people, kind of common people, were telling these stories as a form of entertainment. So they also have an even longer history. The story of King Shahryar and Scheherazade goes back to a pre-Islamic storytelling tradition from Persia. So like the story is set in pre-Islamic Persia, kind of. I mean, they're also described as Muslims, so there's a lot of playing with time. You're not really sure when the story is taking place, but he's kind of supposed to be Shahryar is supposed to be like a Sasanian king, so a king of a kingdom in Persia in the pre-Islamic period. And we also hear about a tradition of Persian storytelling, called 1001 Nights, that did exist in the pre-Islamic period. And so clearly this tradition is kind of continuing in the regions where they're from, but now kind of in a new language, and now taking a bit more like an Islamic tinge or color to it. So for the most part, the 1001 Nights were told among commoners. So we have a problem that there are not many written copies of these stories because they're orally told. And it's kind of exceptional that someone in 1400 in Syria decided to write down a few of these stories. That's kind of the rare exception to the rule. We have other evidence from like elite high literary figures from say the year 1200 who talk about, oh, those commoners, they're telling these terrible stories called 1001 Nights, but they're not interested in kind of writing them down themselves. They see it as this kind of non-elite, like the art of the commoners, right? And they're kind of derogatory about it. Many of the stories are set in what is kind of thought of in this tradition as the Golden Age. So they're set in the city of Baghdad, which was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate or Empire. And they're often set during the reign of a caliph named Harun al-Rashid, who kind of ruled over one of the most prosperous periods in kind of Arab Islamic history. And there's also a lot of stories where Harun al-Rashid is like goes out on the street and disguises himself as a normal person and encounters weird things in the city of Baghdad. So I also, something that's really fun about the Nights is that they are the commoners, the people's vision of what the elites are up to. So that's why it captures such an amazing perspective that often isn't captured in written literature, which is like the imagination of the everyday man, you could say. So often these are set in a court setting, and the people in the court have like no morals. They're supposed to be depicted as being like terrible people who are getting up to no good. They're drinking all the time. There's all these kind of the imagination of what the kind of common man thinks people are doing in a court. But they really were not written down very often, although they are a legitimate kind of authentic Arabic literary tradition. So this is why Galland, Antoine Galland, could only find one manuscript, right? Because they were oral stories and they're not like popular enough or they're not elite enough for people to think you should write them down. And from the perspective of high Arabic literary culture, these are like like rabble, basically. They're low class, these stories. But when Galland published this collection of like legitimate stories that he found in the manuscript, his French readers loved them. They were super popular in France at the time. And this was a period when scholars and the elite Parisians were reading a lot of folk tales and a lot of fairy tales. So there was a big market for this. So after Galland's publication was such a success, his publisher was like, we need more. We need more of these stories. And Galland's like, I published all I had. There's only one manuscript. I translated all of them. But hey, the publisher was demanding, more stories, more money. So Galland went out to try to find more stories. And how did he do that? So he had to be creative in finding more stories because I think he published one volume and there are 12 volumes. So he has to fill many more volumes with stories. Some he collected other kind of authentic Arabic stories that are part of a separate tradition, so not part of the 1001 Nights, but stories like Sinbad the Sailor, if you're familiar. That's another kind of story cycle that did exist in Arabic. It wasn't part of the Nights, but he folded it in to kind of get more stories, to get more money. But other stories, it seems that he just made up completely. And those stories happen to be some of the most famous stories in the 1001 Nights, one being Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and the other being Aladdin. So Aladdin there is no Arabic version of Aladdin. Aladdin only exists for the first time in Galland's writings. And that's how does it happen then? The most famous story that's supposed to be representative of an Arabic storytelling tradition seems to have been fabricated by a French academic in the 18th century. So I tell my class here in my undergrad, the 1001 Nights is not an Islamic classic, and you might even say it's not an Arabic classic at all. So it's more of a European classic that shaped the way that Europeans viewed the Arab world. The 1001 Nights became way more popular in France than it ever had been among literate Arabs before then. And how crazy is that? That part of the image that Europeans developed of what the Arab world is like was actually a product of their own imagination. So it's like you create this idea of the exotic Orient, and then that shapes your idea of that world, even though you yourself were the one who created it. Okay, so that's the story of Antoine Galland. So this brings me to the end of the story of my undergraduate days and my presentation in this class, but I didn't stop there. So after finishing my BA, I was in school for another 10 years and had a lot more to learn. So one thing I learned quite recently, these are places where I did my graduate education. One thing I learned is that while Galland did introduce new stories to the 1001 Nights, they may not have been the product of his own imagination. And that brings me to the final story of this cycle today. So once upon a time, in the city of Aleppo, in the year 1707, there was a young Arab man, a young Arab Christian man named Henna Diab. And he was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Now listen closely. Henna Diab had lost his father when he was a young boy. He learned a lot of languages living in Aleppo, conversing with merchants visiting the city in French and Italian and Turkish. And of course, he's a native Arabic speaker. One day, a French merchant appeared to his city, and he offered him a great opportunity. He said, I'll take you on some travels. It'll really help you establish yourself as a merchant. You could come back home and be prepared and have gained all this experience by traveling with me. Is this sounding a little familiar? Now, the French merchant didn't trap Henna in a magical cave or anything like we just saw in Aladdin, but their relationship was at best uneven and at worst exploitative, right? This is the relationship between the French merchant and a young Arab Christian man. But the Frenchman did deliver on his promise and brought Henna to Paris. And Henna wrote about all these experiences in a travelogue that still survives today. And that's what I had a picture of that on my references slide. So it's been translated. You can read it, his own book of travels and his experiences traveling to Europe as a young man. So Henna Diab got to visit Versailles, the amazing palace outside of France. And he was really impressed with it. And in his travelogue, you can hear how he goes on and on about the amazing gardens. Oh, look at these amazing water features. There seem to be these rivers kind of on the grounds that were kind of created by humans. And he also talks a lot about the throne that he sees in Versailles, this beautiful palace and this amazing throne. Sounding familiar, I hope. So it was while in Paris that Henna was introduced to Antoine Galland, the person who, translated the Nights and then seems to have invented some. So at this time, Galland was working on a new volume of the 1001 Nights, meaning he was looking for more stories. Henna recited several stories to him. So Henna actually met him as a young man. Antoine Galland said, hey, do you know any stories? And Henna gave him some stories. Some of these were stories that he had heard as a young man growing up in Syria, because there was an authentic tradition of storytelling. At this time, you can imagine they'd be taking place in coffee houses, for instance. But other stories he told Antoine Galland seemed to be the product of his own imagination. So scholars today think that he, Henna Diab, this young Arab man, was the ultimate source of the story of Aladdin. And that he might have actually made up this story himself. And people point to some of these similarities that I was trying to draw out between Aladdin's biography and Henna Diab's own biography and his experiences. So while it's true that the popularity of the 1001 Nights is due in large part to European translators and readership, and though some genuine Arabic stories were manipulated and distorted by these translators, we can really think of these stories as a very hybrid creation. And I kind of picture them like a layered cake. So the bottom is there's this real kind of authentic medieval tradition of storytelling that you can find in some translations of the Nights. But also then we have another layer of like these early modern receptions and adaptations. Why are they so interested in the knights? What are the stories that they tend to fixate on? And also, how do they manipulate some of the stories they come across to be more interesting or more in line with European tastes in this time? And then we also have like Henne's involvement. So this is even another layer where there's like this genuine kind of Arab element added to the stories through this kind of living practice of storytelling that was alive when the knights were kind of written down in French and English. And on top are like modern Arabic receptions of and versions of the knight. And like whenever you encounter the knights, you're kind of getting all together. That's why it's like a cake. You can't separate them from each other. So that's why the knights are kind of imagined as the like paradigmatic example of Arabic storytelling. Actually, they received that popularity and that reputation because of the European reception of it. But after they became so popular to Europeans, then kind of erudite and high elite literary Arabs became interested in the stories. Like, why are these French people so obsessed with 1001 Nights? And then we see kind of a living tradition in Arabic literature of kind of dealing with this legacy, of dealing with how do you write about something from your own history that's been kind of so digested through like Orientalism and through Europe. And that's what we read today with Naguib Mahfouz as an example of a modern author who's kind of dealing with this legacy. So before the break, I'll have one last question for you. This is the third question that you can jot down. So this is an excerpt that I have here from Henna Diab's Book of Travels. So I'll have you can read this from where you're sitting and reflect about kind of who do the 1001 Nights have an author? Who is the author? And what does like the involvement of this young Arab man tell us about the history of these stories? And you can jot down some reflections on that, and then we'll go on a break in a couple of minutes. Should I press pause on the record for the break? Oh, that's pause share.
Do you want to pause it now?
Yeah. recording again?
Yes, it is.
Does anyone want to, we'll start off asking if you want to share any reflections about authorship, what you think about. Do you buy the theory that he made up the story of Aladdin? What do you think?
It's just like him from a European perspective, reporting like Arab oral traditions.
Yeah.
Oral stories.
Right.
So like this like excerpt is a perfect example.
Yeah.
Of how like he's interacting with someone from the Arab world.
Yeah.
And like taking down.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a great observation because I said, you know, there are these very rare manuscripts where like Arab decided to write down the 1001 Nights, but for the most part, they just stay alive as oral storytelling. And here, actually, like Galland is able to, he's encountering the tradition of oral storytelling, right? It's not that Hannah is writing it down and passing it. He's also delivering it orally, which also means that the creator, like Galland, his notebooks survive. It is like an amazing resource. So they're preserved in the National Library of France. And we see his notes as he's jotting down notes as he's hearing stories. So he'll write down the date and then he's like Aladdin. He'll start writing down like in note form the Aladdin, and people can study then like maybe what he actually heard when he heard the story of Aladdin and then how that actually appears in the book, like when he fleshes it out and he gets to kind of write this as a story that is going to be written down and not told orally. Then we also see like the presence of Galland. Where does he come in the story? Because then we start seeing some, you know, very kind of some Christian morality, almost like chivalric, like medieval European ideas of chivalry appear in his writings that seem to be like how he's imagining this kind of enchanted past. Any other reflections or questions about this on 10? Has anyone heard of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves? I think there's a movie of that too. I don't know if it's Disney, but I think there was a famous animated movie of Ali Baba as well, which also is like doesn't exist in Arabic. So what I mentioned, the Norton, the annotated Arabian Nights, we had like the translator is translating these stories, some of them from French because they don't have any Arabic kind of equivalent. Okay. It's also interesting that Scheherazade is such an important voice in the stories, but this is quite a masculinist tradition, especially the act of writing it down and translating it. And storytelling, like historically, was a man's profession. So it's both, you know, this kind of interesting contrast where the woman's voice is really valued, but it's always kind of a man speaking through her, if you can imagine. The storyteller's usually a man talking in Scheherazade's voice. Okay, so for the second half of class, we'll be talking about the Arabic novel. I'll start by giving kind of a brief overview of the history of the Arabic novel. And then I'll give you an overview of the reading. So we read kind of 2 chapters from Naguib Mahfouz's book. And these we read like in the book, we're like this far into the book, but the book, they're kind of like, I mean, it's taking inspiration from the 1001 Nights. The chapters do stand alone, but we do see kind of characters reappearing throughout the different stories. But I think that I can appreciate if this felt difficult, especially with like how many names there are. So I'll kind of give a brief overview of what we read in that. Then I have like the in-class activity, which is the back of your piece of paper. I'll give you some time to do that, circulate to answer questions, and then we'll reconvene at the end to go over the handout. So let's start with kind of to understand the Arabic novel and where the Arabic novel is taking inspiration from. I'll talk a little bit about, well, what is Arabic literature before the novel? Because the novel names a particular kind of modern form and the novel, like you might say, didn't really exist before like the 1700s, but of course literature existed before then. In kind of Arabic literature, one of the most kind of exalted forms of Arabic literature is poetry. Poetry is kind of incredibly important to the history of Arabic literature. Poetry also has like strong oral like oral tradition of poetry, of memorizing and passing down poetry, but also poems absolutely survive that had to have been written down to be created because they're so metrically complex and convoluted. Oral literature, like the 1001 Nights, is part of this kind of history of what Arabic literature looked like before the novel. The 1001 Nights, like, as I said, is so famous because of the European reception of these stories. If we can imagine a world where like Galland and his friends never took an interest in the 1001 Nights, we might ask, well, then what would be kind of the more representative text of Arab culture, particularly Arab folk culture? And there actually is a genre of text. They're called siras. So the Sira Beni Hilal is a really famous example of this. A sira is like an epic poem, and sometimes can be in prose too. These really long stories that also have this tradition of being performed like over multiple days by a trained storyteller. So a storyteller could memorize these. This was a profession that historically was passed down from father to son, where you would kind of give your son this kind of repertoire of stories you've memorized. The Sira Beni Hilal is almost a romance about a particular kind of tribe that invaded in North Africa in the 11th century. But it kind of romanticizes this invasion of the tribe and the heroes of this tribe. So there is a kind of strong oral literature tradition. But also, right, these are kind of the folk literature. There's a very kind of strong, important history of high literary prose in Arabic. So at the most basic, this type of literary prose in like classical Arabic was called edeb. For those who like study Arabic today, edeb is just like literature, but it referred to a very particular genre of writing that was not in verse, so it wasn't poetry. Sometimes there were rhyming involved, but not like meter. And edeb was like, to be really good at edeb, you had to be able to like manipulate the Arabic language. It was having like a really wide vocabulary in the language, using the most arcane words you can possibly think of to describe something, which makes a seminar on Arabic edeb very difficult, I know from experience, because the thing that authors are proud of are using like words that no one knows and that are very rare. Edeb also has this kind of broader meaning of not only the particular books that would be written, but the whole kind of culture around kind of elite, well-educated and moral behavior. So to have good edeb also, you can say like that, would mean to have kind of good manners almost. But this was wrapped up in a particular like, elite culture where having good manners also meant that when someone says something about a horse, you'll recite a very famous poem about a horse, right? That is this kind of a literary culture based on memorizing a lot of things. So I just have two examples of like real famous edeb works. So there's this very famous author of edeb called Jahiz, which means like Popeye. That his eyes kind of popped out of his head. And he wrote around like, this is a golden age, right? The year 800. So he has several really famous books, a book of animals he has, and this book of misers is super famous. So basically it's a collection of anecdotes about people who are really stingy and really greedy. So he just kind of makes these kind of funny, they're humorous stories, but they're also like moral stories where he's poking fun at like certain professions also who have a reputation for being stingy. And he's engaging in kind of social critique and also ridicule of people, especially like targeting schoolmasters, beggars, so people who beg for money but don't really need it, singers, and like scribes. So these are all kind of like middling professions that he's making fun of in this book. He's also really famous for a book called, The Superiority of People with Dark Skin Over Those Who Have Light Skin. So that was also funny, again, a book that is like engaging in this kind of like funny but serious, like socially serious, but also humorous. Another kind of format that is like predates the novel, but is a kind of a prose work, are called the Maqamet. And there's one really famous, Maqamet of Hariri, an author named Hariri. These are from the year like 1200, this particular book. So it's a collection, it's a collection of 50 stories, and they're picaresque stories. Does anyone know? Has anyone heard that term, picaresque? What does picaresque mean? Has anyone heard it before? I won't call on you if you say you have. So picaresque refers to usually episodic. So like a person who's getting into a bunch of different scenarios that are funny. And the hero, the main character, is usually like somehow very immoral, but you also love him. So he's like cheating people and tricking them, but you're also kind of rooting for him. This is like the picaresque genre, and it becomes really popular in European and literature as well. So this is a collection of 50 stories where we have two main characters, Harith, who is the one who's the good guy, and then Abu Zaid, the one who's like the trickster who's always getting into trouble. So Harith, the good guy, he's always traveling around kind of the Islamic world broadly, or the Middle East, and he's a merchant. So he's going around to all these different cities to trade. And he keeps running into Abu Zaid. But often the stories will end with it's like Scooby-Doo, like unveiling. Like he meets someone, this person does something weird, and he realizes it's Abu Zaid. So it's kind of like, taking the mask off at the end of the story. But Abu Zaid, he's usually like tricking people out of money, like getting people to pay for things, like tricking them, and usually does so by some type of linguistic feat. So he's often giving these amazing sermons, speeches, sometimes he'll introduce a conceit where he will not use one of the letters of the Arabic alphabet and then give a whole speech with only using words that don't have that letter. So he kind of, clearly these are texts that were written down painstakingly. The author's working really hard to come up with these speeches. But in the story, Abu Zaid is supposed to be such a genius because the character himself seems to be able to just do these on the spot. So I have this picture here. I'll give you a quick overview of one story from the Maqamat. This is the 12th story. So once upon a time, Harith, he's this merchant. He's traveling between Syria and Iraq, and he has to cross a desert. And he joins a caravan, so by people traveling together for protection, basically. And when he comes across a bunch of people, they're all ready to cross the desert together. They all have the same destination in mind, but they are looking for kind of some protection. So usually caravans could pay mercenaries or that this was a business, that you could kind of buy swords to people who are going to protect you from bandits who may come and try to steal the goods that you have in your caravan while you're crossing the desert. So instead of finding mercenaries with weapons, they find this dervish. So a dervish is a very pious, religious-looking man who appears very religious, in his robes and his turban. And he tells them that he can protect them in their travels across the desert. You don't need any swords. Apparently, he says he learned a magic spell or an incantation that was revealed to him while he was dreaming, which implies that this is from a divine source, that ultimately God revealed to him these words, these protective words that he's going to recite as the caravan crosses the desert. It's going to protect them from any bandits. So Harith is with this caravan, and he goes and they cross the desert, and they cross it successfully. The story, the incantation that this dervish is reciting during their travels is written down, and it's really funny. It's kind of making funny rhymes, almost nonsense, and it's kind of poking fun at the idea of what a magical spell would look like. So Harith and the rest of the group, they arrive in Iraq, and then Harith starts to, first the caravan rewards the dervish very generously. So they pay him a bunch of money, they give him gems, gold, and they reward him generously because it was true, their caravan did not get attacked. It seems like his incantation worked. Then Harith hears something that's a bit concerning. Apparently, someone has seen this dervish in a nearby tavern getting super drunk and drinking all this wine and making a big ruckus. And he's like, that doesn't really square with this pious figure that I had in mind, right? You can imagine a very pious Muslim man wouldn't not be drinking wine, and he probably would not be frequenting a tavern. So Harith goes into this tavern, and then we have one of the most famous passages from this collection of stories where the dervish gives this kind of ad hoc performance of this Bacchanalian poem about how wine is so beautiful, I love wine, and all these singing and dancing and girls and all these things. Very like famous, beautiful poetry, basically. And it's here that Harith realizes that this is Abu Zayd in disguise. So this whole time, right, Abu Zayd was just tricking them. He was pretending to be a really religious, pious figure. He took a chance on claiming that he could protect this caravan across the desert. It seemed to work. And then he's happy to have all this gold that he can now spend basically on wine and women. So this is a kind of famous prose genre in Arabic literature. So other prose genres that they're not quite novels, but show this kind of a long history of prose literature in Arabic. One includes travelogues. So we saw like Henna Diab, he wrote a travelogue about his journey from Syria to France. There are many, that's like a late example. We have really early ones about Muslim travelers who then record their journeys. And they're often also engaging in talking about all the fabulous things that they saw, the wonderful things they saw in their travels. Narrative history is another place where kind of we see stories cropping up. Mirrors for Princes, which I mentioned, is something that, right, Scheherazade, the character, would have is said to be familiar with. Mirrors for Princes are these books that tell a king like how to be a good king. And they're always telling stories. They're always talking about kind of mythical kings of the past and giving them kind of as examples of how to be a just, merciful king. We also have like biographical dictionaries or biographies is this long-standing tradition in Arabic literature, as well as animal fables. So Kalila wa Dimna, this is like the most famous kind of book of Arabic animal fables. They also have very old roots, ultimately coming from a Sanskrit tradition from India, but also animal fables, where more so than the Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights, they're very moral. It's always about how to like be a good person and have some type of lesson in their story. So this is kind of like, okay, prose has existed for a long time in Arabic. Historically, kind of Arabic culture has been very, very literate. Paper made its way to the Middle East quite early, especially relative to Europe. So we have many of these old books survive, and a lot of people were able to write down stories and texts on paper because it was quite affordable. So what about the Arabic novel in particular? So we read from an Arabic novel today. So the novel, like when you call something a novel, it's talking about a particular modern form of literature. The novel should be literary. By definition, is something literary. So it's like usually higher kind of culture, high language, and emerged as a genre that's attached to being realistic. And this is like especially emerged in France, but also in other places where the idea of the modern novel as something, right, that you like what we know of in the bookstore today, something that is a story and usually historically kind of is tied to reality as we know it in some way. So in the late 19th and early 20th century in the Arab world broadly, there was, especially in the Levant and Egypt, was a cultural and literary movement called the Nahda. Nahda in Arabic means rebirth. Sometimes it's called the Arab Enlightenment or the Arab Renaissance. And this was a cultural and literary kind of movement where Arabic authors writing in Arabic were kind of reading European literature and interested kind of in the future of where Arabic literature is going to go. They started to use like classical forms, so classical forms from like the history of Arabic literature, and using them to address modern issues. So we have, especially this would happen in poetry, where the qasida is a very kind of famous standard form of a poem. And poets would be interested in taking this form and playing with it and kind of applying it to the modern world. And this is where we see, people playing with 1001 Nights can kind of be understood as this too, that you take this form that is from Arabic literary history and you're playing with it and trying to apply it to the modern kind of world and modern problems. The Nahda we can also think of, right, through this encounter and influence that we see the rise of the Arabic novel, which both kind of adopts this like Western form of a novel, this literary form, but also is informed by classical Arabic too. So it's not like a complete kind of imposition or adoption of something foreign. It's like kind of made indigenous through like applying classical literary forms to these novels. Again, like Naguib Mahfouz is a classic example of this. So since we only read one, I just wanted to like give a little insight into, of course, Arabic novels are some really famous Arabic novels. I'm giving you some examples of these to kind of show how the modern novel is how it is like kind of addressing contemporary issues. So these are three incredibly famous Arabic novels from the 20th century. So Nawal al-Saadawi is very famous socialist feminist Arab writer. This is one of her novels translated to English as A Woman at Point Zero. She wrote this book in 1975. So this is a very kind of feminist book on the plight of womanhood, on how hard it is to be a woman. The main character kind of rejects the kind of social strictures that she feels are put upon her as a woman. She refuses to conform to society's demands. And what follows is an incredibly tragic story of her being exploited and ultimately killed. She kills a man in self-defense and then is like tried and executed for committing this murder. So it's not exactly a happy, uplifting book. But Nawal Saadawi she herself was a physician and very interested in kind of the feminist cause and wanted to kind of capture the difficulties of being a woman in this novel. Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Saleh, another very famous Arabic novel from 1966. Tayeb Saleh is a Sudanese author, and he's kind of playing with this genre from the early modern period where like the native travels to Europe. So there were a lot of texts where people from, say, Egypt, Syria, they're traveling to Europe and they're talking about how amazed they are about what they see there, about the technological advancements and how they want to bring all these advancements home to improve kind of the Arab world. So he's kind of playing with this trope and turning it on its head, where the main character travels to Europe and again, tragedy ensues. And this book is an example of how Arabic literature is, and how authors could deal with the legacy of the violence of colonialism and how that violence of the colonial encounter, so for him, it's kind of the British in Sudan, how the violence of that history like persists in the post-colonial state. And this is also considered a classic of what's called post-colonial literature. And then Naguib Mahfouz, who we read for today, his most famous books are the trilogy. They're called the Cairo trilogy. Children of the Alley is the first in this trilogy. And so he wrote this in 1959. And the three books, it's kind of trying to capture progress, like improvement over time, where we see kind of classic tropes of like what progress means, where it's like leaving religion behind and embracing science. But he's also interested in talking about corruption, the corruption of political rulers, and about like gender issues and how gender kind of social progress for women has like occurred over generations. So we see that in the generations of women in his novel about how their conditions are changing over time. So that brings us to Naguib Mahfouz, who himself is Egyptian. We read today from Arabian Nights and Days. On the top left is like the Arabic cover, which when I first saw it, I thought was like fan art of Taylor Swift. Doesn't that really look like her? Like how she's drawn in fan art? Anyway, but that's just the cover of Arabian Nights and Days in Arabic. So Naguib Mahfouz is himself Egyptian. He won the Nobel Prize in 1988, the Nobel Prize for Literature. And we read from Arabian Nights and Days. So we can think of this as an adaptation of the 1001 Nights, and it's kind of part of what we would call the reception history of the text. So reception history, meaning the history of how a text is read over time, how people engage with that text, and then how they're then inspired by it. So he's very familiar with the tradition of the 1001 Nights, and he's kind of using it to his own ends and playing with it in this book. So it reads as this kind of connection of interlinking stories. Hopefully you found that you can read the stories on their own. And like the 1001 Nights, we even see some kind of characters reappear who we know from the 1001 Nights. He sets this in this kind of timeless setting. Like you don't know when really this is supposed to be taking place. He called it like, this could be a sequel to the 1001 Nights. So it's supposed to kind of be in this sometime in the past, basically, once upon a time, right? But still we see like modern, like critiques of some modern social and political problems that were like contemporary to his world being played out through these stories, even though they're not placed in his modern Cairo, but they're placed in this kind of timeless past. And we can, when in our activity, I'll be asking you to kind of dive into how these stories are functioning as critique. So I'm going to give you time to work on the back of this handout. Before I do so, I thought I would just give you a summary of what you read, which can be difficult. So, right, we encountered all these characters, and I'll leave this slide up for you for when you're working on your handout. But basically, okay, so first we started with the story of Aladdin. Aladdin with the moles on his cheek. So we start with this young man, Aladdin, he's kind of entering the world. So he's leaving his parents' house, at least kind of symbolically, and he's going to take up his own profession. He's trying to make his own way in the world. And his profession is a barber. So he's a barber, he cuts hair. So when he's kind of out on his own for the first time, he encounters this sheikh, like a pious man and teacher, this religious man he's really drawn in by. And this sheikh's name is Sheikh Abdullah al-Balkhi. So his father sees this relationship developing and kind of warns him, like, don't overdo it. You know, you're religious enough. Don't overdo it with your devotion. But the sheikh kind of is encouraging the opposite. He's saying, no, Aladdin can go further in his faith. He has a lot more to learn. And that he's kind of encouraging him to dedicate himself wholly to worship. He does specify, he's like, that doesn't mean I'm telling you not to work, like not to work for money, but that kind of you should, he even says, re-embrace Islam, like become a Muslim again, because you need to become like kind of change the way your orientation towards religion and kind of embrace it more fully. So Aladdin then hears through the grapevine that there was like this situation went down. So he hears that the chief of police, his name is Darwish Omran, tried to set up his son Habazlam, set up his son with the sheikh's daughter, who we later learn is named Zubaydah. So, right, we have the police chief, his son, and the sheikh, and then his daughter. The police chief wants to set them up to be married, but the sheikh refuses. And then the chief of police gets really angry, and then Aladdin is scared. Like, he's afraid of that the police chief is going to kind of, he's afraid of his retribution. So Aladdin keeps studying with the sheikh. He does end up kind of devoting himself to his religion more fully. And then like this continues until one day the sheikh offers to marry Aladdin to his daughter. So Aladdin is now offered the hand of Zubaydah, and he accepts, and then they're married in this small ceremony. And then we learn that something terrible has happened. So the governor of the region says that one of his wife's jewels was stolen. And the chief of police, who is Darwish, right, says that he'll do a search of this quarter. And they raid the house where Aladdin's living with the Sheikh Abdullah, and they find this gem, this jewel, in Aladdin's things. So Aladdin, right, seems to have been the one who stole it. So Aladdin is then arrested, he's in prison, and he's beheaded for his crime. And right, we think he's going to be saved, and he's not saved. This injustice is carried through to the end. He's killed. His family is like really sure he's innocent, and the sheikh like probably thinks so too, but he doesn't do anything to help Aladdin. He doesn't intervene at all. And he just tells his daughter and Aladdin's family, oh, just be patient. This is God's will, basically. And then we hear the sheikh tells this last story that it's kind of like, I think, say like who is the character of the sheikh? Like, what are we supposed to think of him? He tells this last story when he's telling like these grieving family members to be patient. He tells this story. He's like, well, once upon a time, there was this pious man. The man was stuck in a hole, like in the desert. And he considered calling out for help. Hey, help me, help me. Then he said, no, you shouldn't ask a human being for help. You should only ever ask a God. You only ever ask God for help. So he doesn't call out when he hears people walking by. Then people even come and fill in the hole with sand, basically burying him alive. And he still tells himself, I'm not going to interrupt them, basically killing me by filling in this hole, because I shouldn't seek their help. I'm only going to seek help from God. So he prays, and then God saves him. We have this magical creature reaches into the hole, picks up this man, but we learn, right, the punchline is, we have saved you from death with death. So really, he's not being saved. He doesn't survive this, but he's being kind of pulled up by this creature who's kind of taking him into the afterlife. So that's kind of a question. I'm curious what you think about, why does the sheikh tell this story? Then that was the one chapter, and then we read the second follow-up chapter called The Sultan. So The Sultan is a story, but it follows up on the events of Aladdin, where we have a king who's in disguise, and this is a classic trope from the 1001 Nights. So the king is dressed as a merchant, I believe, and he's wandering around the city. And then no one knows who he is. And he's Shahryar, so right, named after the main character of the 1001 Nights. And then he has his vizier with him, and Shabib Rama, who is the executioner. So he's the person who beheaded Aladdin ultimately. So they encounter this man who's like, oh, come with me, I'm going to show you something really exciting. So they're here for adventure, and they accept this invitation. And the three men get on a ship, and this ship brings them to an island. And what they find on this island is like a mock court is taking place. So we have someone play acting as the Sultan himself, and we have someone like play acting as the vizier and the executioner. And they're here putting on the trial against Aladdin again. So Aladdin's father is there. He's in this scene, and he's arguing for Aladdin's innocence. And in this mock trial, Aladdin's innocence is proven. And then it becomes clear that Habazlam, the son of Darish, the chief of police, had planted this gem, right? He's basically framed Aladdin and got him in trouble because he was jealous that Aladdin married Zubaydah, who he wanted to marry. And then in this mock court, right, the judgment happens that didn't happen in real life, where we discover that Aladdin is innocent. And then ultimately the fake Sultan says, like, we should behead the chief of police and his son. And then other people who are involved in this kind of corruption should be fired from their jobs. The Sultan then reveals himself. It's like, what's going on here? I'm the real Sultan. Why are you claiming to be the Sultan? And then we hear from Ibrahim, the water carrier, who's friends with Aladdin's father. And he explains like why he has set up this fake court on this mystical island, or this island kind of in the middle of nowhere, and how he was able to set it up, because it seems like it's pretty expensive. And he says that each night they're holding a tribunal in which justice will take its course in the way that it doesn't take its course in the real world. And then the Sultan is like impressed by the one trial he saw, and he ends up actually adopting like the judgment that the fake court decided. But right, ultimately his judgment can't save Aladdin, who has already been killed for a crime he didn't commit. Okay, so those were the two stories we read. I'll leave this up as the kind of character names and give you about 10 minutes to work on the back of the handout, which asks you to kind of engage with these stories. And I'll circulate and answer any questions that you have. Okay, should I pause again? I guess, okay, I can do it. Here.